Slippery elm bark was coating inflamed throats and raw gut linings centuries before the first pharmacy lozenge ever existed. Cherokee communities in the Appalachian Highlands used it as a practical, repeatable remedy, not ritual, not speculation, just bark, water, and an observable effect. The FDA quietly removed it from official cold and cough formulas in 1989, not because it was dangerous, because it lacked modern proof. Right now, it sits on health store shelves, unmarked, undersold, while a $12 throat spray sits right next to it. The question is why? The inner bark of the slippery elm tree does something almost mechanical when it meets water. It releases a thick, slick gel. Botanists call the compound mucilage. Think of it as a natural coating agent, one that doesn't dissolve and doesn't disappear into whatever liquid it contacts. When swallowed, it moves along the surfaces it touches, the lining of the throat, the esophagus, the upper digestive tract, like a slow, persistent, protective layer drawn over raw, inflamed tissue. That is the entire mechanism. No exotic chemistry, no synthetic process, just bark, water, and the physics of contact. Daniel Moorman's Native American Ethnobotany Database, one of the most comprehensive compiled records of indigenous plant use in North America, documents slippery elm use across dozens of nations and Appalachian communities. This was not isolated knowledge, not one healer in one valley making one educated guess. It was documented, distributed, practical plant literacy that stretched across the eastern woodlands for generations before a single commercial pharmacy existed. So how does something that well documented end up this invisible? Stay with me, because this is where the story starts to feel personal. Picture a small tin box, the kind that once held tobacco or hard candy, found in the back corner of an old Appalachian farmhouse. Inside, wrapped in a folded paper packet, is a fine reddish-brown powder. The handwriting on the outside reads only 3 words: throat and stomach, wet it first. No brand name, no ingredient list, no cautionary label. Just a short instruction from someone who assumed you already knew what the powder was and exactly why it worked. Whoever wrote that note did not think of this remedy as alternative medicine or folk medicine or any medicine at all, really. They thought of it the way you think of salt or vinegar, a known household tool, a thing you simply kept on the shelf. That note is the shape of what was lost. Because the powder is exactly what it promises. You wet it. It gels. The gel coats. The whole mechanism depends on a simple fact. Mucous membranes respond to physical cushioning. A raw throat doesn't only hurt because of infection. It hurts because inflamed, exposed tissue is irritated by every breath and every swallow. The gel does not attack that irritation. It covers it. Temporarily, gently, and with a consistency that becomes easier to understand the longer you think about it. This is not complicated biology. It is not fringe science. It is the application of a well-understood physical property that was recorded, practiced, and trusted for a very long time before the pharmacy aisle replaced it. Here is the part nobody tells you: that replacement was not accidental. Let's put a year on a very long time, 1820. That is when slippery elm first appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of recognized medicines in America. And it did not appear once and disappear. It stayed, year after year, edition after edition, listed as a legitimate pharmacological ingredient for 140 years. Until 1960, 140 years of official pharmaceutical standing. That is not a footnote. That is institutional recognition, stretching from the early republic straight through 2 world wars. During the Civil War, when supply chains broke and field surgeons ran short of almost everything, slippery elm bark appears in medical officer documentation as a gut-soothing agent, used not out of desperation or folklore, but because it was available, it worked on contact, and it was practically free. By the early 20th century, druggist manuals listed slippery elm lozenges as a standard shelf item, stocked beside camphor and castor oil, sold openly, sold cheaply, no prescription required. And then, around 1960, it quietly slipped out of the official record. The exact mechanism of removal hadn't fully shown itself yet. That would come later. In 1972, the FDA launched the OTC Drug Review, a systematic evaluation of every over-the-counter ingredient then on the American market. Reasonable in concept. In practice, it created a three-tier classification. Category 1, safe and effective. Category 2, not safe, not effective, gone. Category 3, insufficient data to determine. Plant-based remedies with centuries of documented use ended up in Category 3, not because they were tested and found inadequate, not because anyone was harmed, because modern classification required modern clinical trial data, and modern clinical trials cost millions of dollars, and no pharmaceutical company was going to spend millions of dollars proving the value of a bark that cost almost nothing to produce and that no one could patent. Slippery elm costs almost nothing. It always did. That was always part of the problem. There is a document from 1989 that should have caused outrage. It didn't. Most people never heard about it. We are going to look at it now. Before the FDA ruling of 1989 made its way into any official register, the knowledge behind slippery elm had already traveled a long and largely uncredited road to get there. James Mooney spent years in the late 19th century documenting Cherokee life, language, and practice for the Bureau of American Ethnology. His records, archived, published, publicly accessible, capture something that tends to get smoothed over in the popular retelling of American herbal history. Cherokee communities were not simply using plants as a last resort in the absence of better options. They had developed coherent, repeatable, observationally refined systems of plant-based care across generations. Slippery elm was part of that system, used for respiratory illness, digestive distress, wound management, documented not as ceremony, not as spiritual ritual, but as practical community medicine that worked reliably enough to be passed forward deliberately. Early European settlers in Appalachia did not arrive at slippery elm independently. They adopted it. They learned which bark, which preparation, which application, because the knowledge was already there, already functional, already refined. That is how it entered the American folk medicine mainstream. That is how it found its way into the USP in 1820. That is how it ended up in the druggist manuals, the Civil War field kits, the lozenge boxes of the early 20th century. Cherokee hands carried it into American homes. Then, slowly, officially, it was reclassified out of them, without credit, without compensation, without most people ever knowing the origin of what they'd lost. Ask yourself, who actually benefited when that cheap, effective bark remedy was cleared from the shelf? This is where it changes. When slippery elm lost its standing through the over-the-counter drug review process, something specific happened that most people miss entirely. Manufacturers were no longer permitted to market it using throat-soothing language on the front label. The word soothes became legally complicated. The phrase coats the throat became a drug claim requiring proof the bark's owners couldn't afford to generate. So the product could still exist, but it could only be sold in the vague, legally cushioned language of a dietary supplement. The 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act formalized this division. Plants on one side, drugs on the other. Drug claims require clinical trial data. Supplements can say almost nothing about what they actually do. A company selling slippery elm bark powder could no longer tell you on the label what the bark had been trusted to do for a century and a half. And the shelf space that opened up filled immediately. Menthol lozenges, benzocaine drops, proprietary blends of artificial flavors and synthetic anesthetics, packaged brightly, priced high, backed by advertising budgets no bark farmer could match, not removed because it failed, removed because proving it would cost millions, and the bark costs almost nothing. That is not a conspiracy. That is a system operating exactly as designed. A system that rewards expensive proof and quietly punishes cheap, patentable plants that work through simple, observable physics. The 1989 FDA Federal Register ruling on over-the-counter, antitussive and expectorant drug products is a publicly archived document. It is dry reading. Bureaucratic language, category assignments, footnotes, But buried in its reclassifications is slippery elm bark, moved from Category 1, safe and effective, to Category 3, insufficient data, not dangerous, not harmful, not shown to cause a single injury across the decades it spent in official American medicine. Simply reclassified as unproven, in an era that redefined proof to mean something only the wealthiest entities in the country could produce. Here is what makes that reclassification more striking. Canada and the United Kingdom continued allowing slippery elm-based products to carry soothing claims for years beyond that ruling. Same plant, same bark, same mechanism, different regulatory philosophy, different answer. The American market was not responding to a global scientific consensus that slippery elm had been found ineffective. It was responding to the internal logic of a review process that equated expensive modern trial with proven and left everything else behind. Notice what that means. It is still there, right now. Legally sold in bulk powder, in capsules, in the occasional lozenge that carries just enough traditional credibility to survive the supplement aisle. Largely untouched by marketing budgets, largely unlabeled in any meaningful way, sitting quietly on a shelf next to products that cost 10 times more and coat nothing. The bark that once sat in every Appalachian medicine cabinet, the bark that crossed from Cherokee plant knowledge into early American home care, that held its place in official pharmacy for 140 years, that soothed throats in farmhouses and field hospitals and druggist shops across 2 centuries, is still available. For less than the price of 1 box of branded lozenges. A seasonal sore throat, a rough stomach morning, that irritated raw feeling after a long dry flight or a night of bad acid. These are ordinary discomforts. They are also exactly the scale at which this remedy was always used. Practical, low cost, requiring nothing more than powder, water, and a moment of patience. Cherokee communities built that knowledge across generations of careful observation. It traveled into American homes through indigenous hands. It earned 140 years of official recognition. It was not disproven. It was deprioritized, quietly, profitably, and with almost no public notice. And it is still here. The people who find this information are not the type who just accept whatever is on the pharmacy shelf. You are clearly not one of those people. Has anyone in your family ever used slippery elm or any bark remedy you grew up knowing about? Drop it in the comments. The next video goes deeper into a root that was actually patented, then pulled from clinical trials for reasons that will make you genuinely angry.